Welcome to Bayou Time. I'm Jacob DeGate, and it's now my pleasure to introduce a person who has been a great friend to this area and has been a part of a lot of crucial efforts to protecting and rebuilding our coast. We have the chairman of CPRA, Chip Kline. Thank you very much for joining us, Chip.
Good to be with you, Jacob. How you doing?
Doing okay, and of course, Hurricane Ida, we're still in recovery mode, as you know. I know, thankfully, some more funding has came to this area. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So in recent months, as a result of the work of our congressional delegation and members of Congress, we have gotten not only an emergency supplemental passed that addresses a lot of the impacts that we faced during Hurricane Ida, but we also had a major infrastructure bill that was passed. And Morganza to the Gulf, the hurricane protection system that protects Lafourche and Terrebonne parishes, was the recipient of about $380 million. And that is the first large tranche of federal money that project has received. There's been some annual allocations previous to that large allocation. But when you're talking about a project that is close to $3 billion, you know, allocations of $8 to $9 million isn't going to build it. And so we need these large annual tranches of federal funding if we're going to continue to make progress on Morganza to the Gulf that we've seen in recent years. So $378 million was appropriated for Morganza to the Gulf. There are other areas that were impacted from Hurricane Ida that are also receiving federal funds, from Grand Isle, from New Orleans to Venice and Plaquemines Parish, additional money for the river parishes, for West Shore Lake Pontchartrain. And then even going into Southwest Louisiana, there was significant funding, close to $200 million for home elevations and coastal restoration projects in Cameron and Calcasieu parishes. And they are continuing to recover from the impacts of Hurricane Laura and Delta. But Hurricane Ida, I mean, you know this, Jacob, it was the strongest storm to ever hit our state. It was the fifth costliest storm to ever hit the United States. We were just looking at the impacts to the electrical grid. So Hurricane Ida alone caused more damage to the electrical grid in South Louisiana than Katrina, Delta, and Zeta did combined. And so extensive damages were done to South Louisiana. But I also think it's important, Jacob, to point out the fact that we had a much different picture on the ground in South Louisiana following Hurricane Ida than we did following Hurricane Katrina and Rita. Yes, there was extensive debris damage from wind, but you did not see the flooding across South Louisiana that you saw during Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita. And that is as a result, or is due to the fact that there have been hundreds of millions of dollars in state and local dollars that have been pumped into these levee protection systems around the greater New Orleans area. Obviously, Katrina, there was a lot of money for the greater New Orleans area, but Terrebonne and Lafourche, I say this every time I come down to Terrebonne and Lafourche, you guys don't wait on the federal government to show up. You continue to tax yourselves through constitutional millages and sales taxes that has allowed your hurricane risk reduction system and your levee protection system to be largely built with just state and local dollars. And as a result, you did not see that flooding in South Terrebonne and South Lafourche that you saw during Hurricane Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, Isaac, all of those storms that followed the 2005 storms. So a lot of progress has been made, but the opportunity that is in front of us for a risk reduction and restoration standpoint, I think could not be greater as a result of the state funding that we have in place, but also the federal funds as well.
Well, yeah, the state has certainly been a great partner for over the past two administrations, really, that have led to some of those efforts, and we thank CPRA certainly for their efforts and all that y'all have done. Now, you mentioned a little bit about the the new money that's coming. That, of course, we didn't wait on the federal government, but now that the federal government is starting to come to our door, we're starting to see some people that haven't visited this area now show up. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, one of the greatest things that we've seen in recent months, really following Hurricane Ida, is that officials at the highest level of the federal government are coming down to South Louisiana. You have the chief of engineers, General Spellman, who actually requested to do a flyover of Morganza to the Gulf. He met with a lot of local leaders, from Parish President Archie Chasson, Parish President Gordy Dove, all of the various levee district directors in your area, to see firsthand of what this project is all about. And so that was just a couple of months ago, and we received word this week that the number 2 general within the Corps of Engineers and members of the Assistant Secretary of the Army's office, as well as officials from the Federal Office of Management and Budget, are coming down here. And again, they have asked to see Morganza to the Gulf. And so there's an incredible story to be told about Morganza to the Gulf. And so the greatest thing in my mind is that it speaks to, no matter who is in office, a Republican or a Democrat. And so, President Trump used to talk about oil and gas exploration and service opportunities and regulatory reform efforts. And now you have President Biden talking about alternative energy and wind and resilience and equity. Morganza to the Gulf speaks to every single one of those priorities. And so, as I like to say it, it's just this plum that is ready to be picked for funding. And I just think that it's great that as a result of the Morganza Action Coalition, all of the work at the local level, from the levee district director, from your elected officials in that area, and those of us that work at CPRA, I think the federal government's ear is finally turned towards Terrebonne and Lafourche.
Obviously, a lot of those efforts are going towards one area that was hit the hardest, which is Grand Isle. Can you talk a little bit about what's going to be happening in the near future there?
Sure. So, first of all, anytime that there's a storm headed towards South Louisiana, our first, attention is given to Grand Isle, only inhabited barrier island in South Louisiana, and it was completely devastated during Hurricane Ida. And so the sand dune that was on the Gulf side was completely washed out in several places. The burrito tube that is underneath that sand dune on the Gulf side was blown out in several locations. And as a result of the continued impacts from recent storms going back to Hurricane Zeta, the Corps of Engineers was just given $122 million to repair the damages to the island. And so it's important for your viewers to realize that the $122 million is for repair efforts, so to repair the dune, to pump additional sand, to repair some rock revetment over there by the Bridgestone Marina, some additional rock work on the western side of the island, which continues to deteriorate from storms. But our efforts on Grand Isle don't stop there, Jacob. And so, again, $122 million for repairs, but there still needs to be a long-term plan for the overall sustainability of Grand Isle. And in my mind, that calls for segmented breakwaters, rocks across the entire perimeter of the island on the Gulf side, a more resilient sand dune or levee on the Gulf side, because as anybody who spends time on Grand Isle knows, that just pumping sand on top of that burrito tube is not sufficient. It continues to wash away during small tropical storms. And so it's got to be a combination of a more resilient levee or dune on the Gulf side with breakwaters going across the perimeter, and then finishing the breakwaters that are going on the backside of the island. And this year, with the help of Chairman Jerome Zerang, Representative Joe Ogeron, we were able to get an additional, probably close to $8 million for some additional rock work on Caminada Pass, which was also impacted during Hurricane Ida. And so, Jacob, you hear a lot of these leading scientists and experts from around the world continue to give you these doom and gloom forecasts for sea level rise and climate change projections. And some people give up on Grand Isle, but not those of us that work at CPRA. Grand Isle is a special place. It's part of the sportsman's paradise. It's one of the things that makes South Louisiana the place that it is. And I think it needs to be a priority for those of us that work in the protection and restoration space for many years.
Sure, I couldn't agree more. That's one of my favorite places on earth, really. The island is a special place, and those rocks, I'm sure, will make the mayor very happy, because I know he always, harps on that, the need for additional rocks there.
He calls at least once a week asking for rocks, and so does Rick Bootery, who is a resident of Thibodaux. He calls a lot asking what the status. And so there's just a lot of passion, a lot of pride and passion for Grand Isle, and that's why it continues to be a priority for us.
Well, it also makes some nice more speckled trout spots on the front side right by my camp, so I would definitely love if those go all the way around. But of course, camps are one thing, homes are another, and protecting those people's homes is certainly, I know, a priority of y'all in CPRA. One other thing, speaking of home protection or I guess insurance about it is the NFIP program. I know that there's some more developments on that if you want to touch on that a little
Well,
bit.
I mean, look, we can tout the success that we've had on protection and restoration for the last several years, but if you're building all of these protection features and flood insurance rates continue to skyrocket to the point to where people can't afford to live where they are now, that's a problem. You've got billions of dollars that are being pumped into these levee systems and these flood protection systems, but as a result of that, flood insurance rates should be going down, not up. And I'll never forget when we were meeting with Steve Scalise just last year sometime, Wendell Curall, the executive director of the South Lafourche Levee District, got a premium notice for flood insurance for somebody that lives in South Lafourche. And their flood insurance more than tripled on an annual basis. And that's unacceptable. So there's a lot of issues that are in play here. The mapping, first of all, is that the FEMA's maps have got to be updated to reflect the progress that has been made on these levee protection systems so that they can take into account the level of protection that residents are getting, which therefore should lower flood rates. And so their maps seem to be completely out of date and uninformed. And so we continue to work that issue. But then there's also got to be legislation to ensure that the NFIP continues to be funded. And so providing 100-year level of protection against some of the most strongest storms allows for residents around South Louisiana to participate in this national flood insurance program.
Sure, and I think
and
with all those rising rates, I think it's going to lead to more people just dropping flood insurance, which is going to ultimately lead to the federal government having to spend more money in the back end. But Chip, we were about out of time. I just wanted to thank you very much for all that you do. We certainly appreciate it, and thank you for coming on.
All right, Jacob, thanks for having me on, man.
Stay tuned for more right here on HTV.